My name is Richard Hale. I'm 67 years old, and for most of my life, I believed that telling the truth was the only way a man could live with himself. That belief died the night I realized something far worse than prison existed. If I spoke the truth, my son's life would end, not metaphorically, not emotionally, legally, publicly, permanently. So I did the unthinkable. I stayed silent. I let my name be dragged into courtrooms. I signed documents that rewrote my future and erased my reputation. I watched people I'd known for decades turn away, while my son slept peacefully, unaware that his clean life was built on my quiet destruction. People say silence is cowardice, but what if speaking up would destroy the one person you were born to protect? If you were in my place, what would you choose? Before I tell you how this all began, tell me where you're watching from and what time it is right now. 5 years ago, the city where I lived was still quiet in a way that made people believe everything was in order. Clean streets, low administrative buildings, cafes opening on time and closing on time. No one asked too many questions. No one dug too deep. I had been retired for 3 years, having stepped away from the construction company I built from nothing, handed operations over to a new board of directors, and kept an old legal entity simply to tidy up the books. As the accountant once advised, I believed the hardest part of my life was behind me. I had raised my son safely, given him a decent education, and now I only wanted to live out the rest of my days in silence. I didn't know that very silence was being prepared into a trap, legal, tidy, and beautifully stamped. Evan called me one winter afternoon. His voice was faster than usual, a little rushed, but it still carried the familiar confidence of someone who believes he has everything under control. He said he needed to meet me, that there was a small matter related to old paperwork, and that it would be best to meet at a lawyer's office for convenience. I didn't ask much. Since Evan graduated, I had learned not to interfere too deeply in his life. I thought that was how you respected a grown man. The law office was on the 3rd floor of a gray building, the elevator slow and cold, the smell of old paper mixed with overnight coffee. The conference room wasn't large. The fluorescent lights were so white, they made people's skin look paler. On the table was a stack of files arranged almost too neatly, as if everything had already been decided. Lawyer Coleman was the kind of person who spoke in long sentences, but never went straight to emotion. He didn't look at me for long, speaking mostly to Evan, as if I were just part of the background. He explained that Evan was involved in a sensitive project related to permits, investment cash flow, and a few transfers that hadn't been recorded at the proper time. No words like crime, serious violation, or risk of prosecution were mentioned. Instead, there were softer phrases: adjustment, restructuring, optimization of legal liability. It all sounded like a complicated accounting problem rather than a moral one. I sat there listening, nodding out of habit from years in meeting rooms, but my mind was slower. I no longer worked within that system, and legal language has a way of making you feel like you understand when, in fact, you don't. Coleman said the safest, most legal solution was to transfer part of the responsibility to my old legal entity. That company still existed on paper, was still in my name, and because it no longer operated in practice, it could absorb the necessary adjustments without affecting Evan's current project. He emphasized that this was only temporary, that everything would be handled once the sensitive period passed. Evan sat beside me, occasionally turning to look at me, his eyes carrying an almost absolute trust, not in the lawyer, but in me. He knew I always stood by him. I had stood by him since the first day he learned to walk, and perhaps that was exactly what kept me from realizing where I was stepping. I asked only one question, the question I now wish I had asked many more times. Is there any risk for me in this? Coleman smiled, the smile of someone who had answered that question hundreds of times. He said the risk was very low, almost non-existent, that everything was within the bounds of the law, that I wouldn't have to appear publicly or attend any hearings. Evan cut in, his voice gentle but firm, as if reassuring a child rather than his father. "Dad, this is just paperwork. I'll fix everything later." The sentence was spoken too easily. No hesitation, no further explanation, just a vague promise placed on the shoulders of someone used to carrying burdens. I looked at the stack of papers in front of me, small, dense lines of text, clauses overlapping like a maze. I had signed bigger contracts than this, more complicated ones, but this time I no longer had my own legal team, no longer had the vigilance of someone directly running a business. I was a father being asked for help by his son in a cold room with a lawyer speaking in the voice of certainty. I thought about the years I worked 12-hour days so Evan wouldn't have to. I thought that if this was a small price to give him a clean path, then perhaps it was something I should do. I saw no blood, heard no screaming, sensed no danger. I saw only paper, a pen, and a future described as safe. When I signed my name on the final page, there was no thunder, no warning signs. Coleman gathered the files, placed them into his leather briefcase, and Evan stood up first, lightly patting my shoulder as a thank you. We talked about trivial things afterward, weekend plans, a meeting Evan needed to prepare for. No one talked about the possibility that things could go wrong. No one said that once you sign, there are things that can't be fixed later, as Evan believed. I walked out of that building with the feeling that I had just fulfilled a family duty, unaware that in the cold system of the law, that duty had just been recorded as a confession. And it was in that seemingly harmless moment that my first silence was laid as a foundation. The first letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slid halfway under my front door like an apology that didn't quite want to enter the house. It wasn't dramatic. No sirens, no agents in dark jackets. Just a formal notice requesting my presence for clarification related to financial activities. I remember standing there with the envelope in my hand, reading the same sentence 3 times, waiting for my brain to supply a different meaning. This was supposed to be temporary. Paperwork. Something Evan would fix later. I told myself there had been a mistake, that someone would glance at the file, nod, and send me home. That was the last morning I believed that. The investigation unfolded the way cold weather does, quiet at first, then everywhere. Another letter followed, then a phone call, then a request for documents I hadn't touched in years. They asked about transactions I didn't recognize, dates I couldn't place, decisions I never made. Each question felt oddly polite, as if manners could soften the implication. I answered what I could. I said, I don't recall, more times than I liked. The rooms where they interviewed me were always too bright or too dark, never comfortable, designed to make time stretch. I kept expecting Evan to call to say there had been a misunderstanding, that his lawyer was handling it. He didn't. When I reached out, his replies were short, busy, in meetings. We'll talk soon, Dad. Soon never came. What came instead were headlines that didn't use my name at first, just phrases like former construction executive and irregularities tied to legacy entities. I recognized myself in those words the way you recognize your own shadow on a wall, distorted but unmistakable. The local paper ran a small photo from years ago, cropped from a charity event, my smile frozen in a context that now felt mocking. People I'd known for decades stopped waving when they drove past my house. At the grocery store, conversations lowered when I entered an aisle. Not accusations, not yet, just distance. Suspicion is quieter than anger, and it lasts longer. Neighbors who used to ask about my garden suddenly had reasons to hurry. A man I played cards with on Thursdays canceled for a while. The invitations dried up without explanation. I learned slowly that reputation doesn't shatter in one loud moment. It erodes, one raised eyebrow at a time. Each small withdrawal of trust felt heavier than the last. At night, I sat at my kitchen table and replayed the meeting in that cold office, the way Evan had looked at me, certain, calm. I told myself that this discomfort was temporary, that fathers endure worse things, that as long as Evan's future remained intact, this was tolerable. Then the summons came, formal, unavoidable. I was advised to retain counsel of my own. The irony wasn't lost on me. I sat across from a new lawyer, younger, more direct, who didn't sugarcoat the words. Exposure, liability, potential charges. He asked why the company existed, why it had absorbed these transactions, why oversight appeared non-existent. I answered honestly, because my son asked me to help. He paused at that, pen hovering, then continued as if I hadn't said anything at all. The system has a way of filtering out motives it can't quantify. Evan's calls became rarer. When we spoke, he sounded distracted, impatient. He asked how things were on my end, as if the storm belonged to me alone. I wanted to ask him if he understood what was happening, if he realized how far this had gone. But every time the words rose, I swallowed them. I imagined the consequences if I spoke too plainly. I imagined his name in the same headlines, his plans unraveling. The thought tightened my chest, so I stayed with safer sentences. I'm managing. Don't worry. Focus on your work." He thanked me briefly and moved on to other topics. The distance between us grew not from conflict, but from avoidance. Silence stacked itself between us like unopened mail. Months passed. The investigation expanded. What had been a clarification became a case. What had been a case became a cloud that followed me everywhere. I sold my truck to cover legal fees, then some tools, then the watch my wife had given me years before she died. Each sale felt like shedding a layer of my past. I stopped planning for the future because planning requires a belief in continuity. Friends professed concern in private messages they never sent publicly. Support, it turns out, is easier when it's invisible. I stopped correcting people when they assumed the worst. It required less energy than defending myself with half-truths. Through it all, I wasn't angry. That surprised me. I kept waiting for rage to arrive, for some righteous heat to carry me through, but it never did. What settled instead was emptiness, a hollowing out. Anger implies a direction. Emptiness just sits. I woke up each morning, made coffee, read whatever new development had surfaced, and waited. I waited because waiting felt like action when there was nothing else I could do. I told myself that endurance was a form of love, that fathers absorb impact so their children don't have to. I repeated one sentence like a prayer I didn't fully believe: as long as Evan is okay. One afternoon, while sorting through old boxes in the basement to find receipts my lawyer requested, I came across the file from that first meeting. It had been pushed to the back, beneath tax returns and insurance policies, forgotten because forgetting had been easier. I opened it without much expectation, flipping through pages I barely remembered signing. The language was dense, clinical. Then I saw it. A clause I hadn't noticed before, buried where eyes tend to slide past. It outlined responsibility in a way that felt heavier than the rest, broader, less temporary. It didn't say interim. It didn't say subject to revision. It was clean, final. I read it again, slower this time, my pulse ticking louder with each line. This wasn't just paperwork. This was a transfer, not of inconvenience, but of consequence. I closed the folder and sat there on the basement steps, the cold seeping through my jeans. The house was quiet, too quiet. For the first time since the letters began arriving, a new feeling surfaced. Not anger, not fear, but clarity edged with dread. I had trusted that the system would eventually recognize intent, that someone would see the truth beneath the signatures, but intent doesn't leave a paper trail. Signatures do. I realized then that the silence I had chosen wasn't just shielding Evan from harm. It was sealing my own fate, line by line, clause by clause. I didn't know yet how far that silence would carry me. I only knew that whatever came next, it had already been written, and my name was on every page. I met Evan again on an evening when everything around him seemed brighter than my life at that time. The restaurant was in the city center, all glass and warm yellow light, the kind of place people go to be seen. I arrived 10 minutes early, sat at a table near the window, watched the stream of people passing by, and reminded myself that I was only there to see that my son was doing well. That was all. Not to demand anything, not to explain. When Evan walked in, I recognized him immediately, not because of his familiar face, but because of the way people turned their heads. A well-fitted suit, a confident stride, the smile of someone who was winning. He looked exactly like everything I had once hoped he would become. He hugged me quickly, politely, more like a social habit than a gesture of closeness. Evan talked about work before I could ask about his health, about a new project, about long meetings, about the future. I listened and nodded, trying to keep up with his fast, energetic pace of speech. Not once did he ask how things were going for me. Not once did he mention the letters, the summonses, the meetings with lawyers I had gone through in silence. I told myself that perhaps he didn't know, that perhaps what was happening was still too distant to touch his life. When the server brought the drinks, Evan raised his glass to celebrate a deal he had just signed. I raised mine as well, even though my mind was only on what I would sell next to pay legal fees. For a moment, amid the surrounding laughter and conversation, I almost spoke. Not the whole truth, just part of it. A hint that things were not as simple as he thought. But then I looked into Evan's eyes, at that undisturbed confidence, and I stopped. I didn't want to be the bearer of bad news on a successful evening. I had grown accustomed to sacrificing my moments to preserve his. The conversation shifted when Evan asked, almost casually, how things had been for me lately. I said fine. One word. He nodded, accepting that answer as a complete truth. Then, not in a reproachful tone, but in the voice of someone who believed he was stating the obvious, Evan mentioned the news articles. He said that perhaps I had trusted people too easily, been too loose with old books. He said it like a general observation, not aimed directly at me, but I felt each word drop like a small stone, steady and unforgiving. And then the sentence came, unprepared and unconsidered. "Dad, you should have been more careful. This isn't my responsibility." I didn't react right away. I didn't argue. I didn't explain. I just looked at Evan, trying to find some sign that he was testing me, that he knew more than he was saying. But there was nothing. In his eyes, there was no deceit, no guilt, only separation. A line drawn very clearly. This was the father's matter. That was the son's life. In that moment, I understood that Evan truly believed what he had just said. He believed I had brought this trouble upon myself. He believed he stood outside it, clean, uninvolved. The feeling then didn't resemble betrayal. Betrayal requires intent. This felt more like being forgotten, as if everything I had done, every signature, every sleepless night, everything I had sold, didn't exist in his world. I thought about the clause in the old file, about how everything had been arranged for me to be the one on record, the one to bear the weight. I thought about the possibility that Evan truly didn't know, that he had been shielded too well, that the people around him had done an excellent job of keeping him innocent. But another part of me wasn't sure. Not because I suspected my son of malice, but because I realized that innocence can sometimes be a choice when one doesn't want to dig deeper. Dinner ended politely. Evan paid a small gesture that carried a larger meaning, as if he were closing my role in his life. Before leaving, he lightly patted my shoulder and said everything would be fine, that I should rest more. I stood there watching him walk out of the restaurant, merging into the lights and traffic, part of a world that was moving forward. I felt no resentment in my heart, only a widening emptiness where I had once thought I had a place. On the way home, I understood that what hurt me most wasn't the possibility of losing my freedom, nor the prospect of judgment. It was the moment my son looked at me as someone who had created his own mistakes and didn't need saving. I had stayed silent to protect him, but in that silence, I had also erased my role in his eyes. And when you are looked down upon by your own child, not with contempt, but with indifference, you realize there are prices not recorded in any sentence, yet still paid, day after day, in quiet. The call came while I was sitting alone in the dark kitchen, where the light above the sink was the only one still on. I didn't need to look at the screen to know it wasn't Evan. His calls now always had a schedule, a clear purpose. This number was different. I hadn't seen it in months. When I picked up and heard Coleman's voice, I understood immediately that the silence I had relied on for so long was beginning to crack. Coleman didn't beat around the bush. He never did when there was bad news. He said that an independent audit team had been appointed to review old files, including the legal entity in my name, not because they suspected me, but because certain details in the chain of transactions no longer matched the original narrative. Someone had asked questions. Someone had dug deeper than was safe. And when the system starts looking back, it doesn't look with trust, but with cold logic. Coleman said that in the course of that review, it was very likely they would discover the real connection between the financial decisions and Evan's project. I asked the question I had been afraid to ask all along. If that happened, what would follow? Coleman was silent for a few seconds, long enough for me to know the answer wouldn't be pleasant. He said that if I cooperated fully, if I clearly stated that the decisions did not originate from me, that I was only the one who stood in name at someone else's request, then there was a strong chance I could be cleared. The records would be adjusted. Part of my reputation could be restored, but the price of that truth was stated immediately afterward, without disguise. Evan would be placed under investigation, no longer a name on the outside, no longer not involved. Prosecution was a real possibility. When the call ended, the kitchen returned to silence. I sat there for a long time, not turning on another light, not getting up. For the first time since the day I signed those papers, I saw a door open, another path, a path where I could step out of the role of the silent scapegoat, a path where I could say that I had not done the things people were accusing me of. I imagined standing before a panel, speaking calmly, presenting evidence, watching expressions change. I imagined walking down the street without lowering my head, imagined reclaiming my name, not just in my heart, but on paper, on the lines that had blackened it. But alongside those images was another one, clearer and more painful. Evan, in a perfect suit, sitting across from questions he had never prepared to answer. Evan being named for the first time in a setting where he had no advantage. I thought of what he had said in the restaurant, of the way he separated himself from me with an invisible boundary. I wondered whether that boundary would still exist once the truth was spoken. I wondered whether he would look at me differently, not as a careless father, but as a father who chose the truth over him. That night, I didn't sleep. I paced the living room, stopping in front of old photographs. Evan as a child, grinning with teeth showing, his hand gripping my finger. Evan on graduation day, eyes full of belief that the world was fair if you were smart enough. I remember teaching him that every action has consequences, that you must take responsibility for what you do. And now that lesson had returned. Not for him, but for me. I was the only one who could activate those consequences just by speaking, just by opening my mouth. Coleman called again the next morning, asking what I had decided. His voice was neutral, professional, as if he were asking about an investment choice. I said I needed time. He reminded me that time was not on my side, that once the review went deep enough, I could lose control of the narrative. I understood that. I understood that silence is also a decision, and every decision has consequences. But this time, the consequences were no longer abstract. They had a name. They had a face. They had a future I had spent my entire life protecting. I sat alone again, placing the two choices before me like tangible objects. On one side was justice, reputation, truth. On the other was my son, with everything he could lose if I spoke. I wondered whether there was any balance between the two, or whether this was a problem whose solution always left a wound. I had once believed that telling the truth was the only way to live rightly. Now I stood before a question with no correct answer. Was justice worth more than my son? And if I chose justice, would I still be his father, or merely a man who finally chose himself after too many years of silence? The truth didn't come to me all at once. It arrived the way disappointment usually does, quietly, through something small that shouldn't have mattered, but did. A forwarded email. Not meant for me. Evan's assistant had sent it by mistake, then tried to recall it too late. I read it standing by the mailbox, the paper thin in my hands. The words heavier than anything I'd signed before. It wasn't a confession. It wasn't even dramatic. It was a summary. Bullet points, timelines, contingencies. My name appeared where responsibility needed to land. Evans didn't. I read it twice, then a third time slower. There it was. Acknowledgement of legacy exposure. Recognition that the old entity in my name would absorb residual risk. And a note about maintaining operational distance until the review concluded. Evan knew enough to plan around it, enough to benefit from it, enough to stay clean. What he didn't do was intervene. What he didn't do was call me. The silence between us wasn't ignorance, it was strategy. I sat down on the front steps and felt something give way, not loudly, not all at once, just a quiet collapse of a belief I'd been carrying for years. I had told myself that Evan didn't know, that he was shielded, that the machine around him had kept him innocent. That story had made my silence feel noble, necessary, but the email stripped that story bare. He knew enough to understand the cost, and he chose to let me pay it. I confronted him, not with anger, but with questions. We met in his office this time, glass walls, framed awards, the hum of importance. I asked him what he knew. He answered carefully, not denying, not admitting. He spoke in the same language Coleman had used years earlier: risk mitigation, timing, exposure. When I asked why he hadn't told me, he looked at me with something like regret. But it didn't move him. He said there was no point reopening wounds, that things were already in motion, that stopping now would only make it worse. For everyone. For everyone didn't include me. Not really. I realized that as he talked. I realized that my suffering had been factored in, weighed, and accepted as tolerable. A variable, not a tragedy, not an injustice, just a cost of doing business. I wanted to ask him when he stopped seeing me as his father and started seeing me as a buffer. I didn't. Some questions don't need answers once you understand the math. He told me, gently, that the review would likely pass if no one complicated it, that the system prefers quiet resolutions, that the world moves on faster when no one insists on being right. He didn't say, please stay silent. He didn't have to. The request was already embedded in the plan. I looked at him and saw a man who had learned very well how the world works. Perhaps too well. He wasn't cruel. That would have been easier. He was pragmatic. And that was worse. I left his office without raising my voice, without promises, without ultimatums. Outside, the city moved the way it always does. People rushing, deals closing, lives continuing. I understood then that telling the truth wouldn't restore what I had lost. It would only add another casualty. Evan's career would stall, his reputation would fracture. And for what? So I could say I had been right? So the record could be corrected while relationships burned? I had already paid so much. The idea of payment continuing, just in a different currency, felt unbearable. That night, I sat alone and read the email again. This time, I didn't look for loopholes. I looked for clarity. And I found it in a sentence that had nothing to do with law or money. Some truths aren't hidden. They're ignored. The realization settled over me like dust after demolition. Evan didn't need the full truth. He had chosen not to know it, chosen convenience over clarity, and by doing so, he forfeited something I hadn't realized was fragile until it broke. I called Coleman the next day and told him I wouldn't be adding anything to the record. He asked if I was sure. I said yes. He asked if I understood the consequences. I said I did. This time, I meant it. Silence wasn't protection anymore. It was finality. It was me closing a door not out of hope, but out of recognition. The truth wouldn't save us. It wouldn't make us whole. It would only prove something that no longer needed proving. So I decided not to speak. Not now. Not later. Not ever. Not because I was afraid and not because I believed my silence would be rewarded. I chose it because the person who would have benefited most from the truth had already decided he didn't deserve it. And when you understand that, silence stops feeling like sacrifice. It becomes acceptance. I made my choice on a very ordinary morning. There was no dramatic music, no cinematic moment. I simply sat at the kitchen table, watching sunlight fall across the scratches in the wood, and called Coleman back. I told him I would not change my statement. I would not add anything new. I would not reopen the past. On the other end of the line, he was silent for a moment, then said he understood. I'm not sure I understood myself at that time. I only knew that if I opened my mouth, I would no longer be the father I had tried to be my entire life. A few months later, the case closed the way the system always does. There was no public apology, no corrective article. I didn't go to prison, but I wasn't fully cleared either. My name still exists somewhere in records that anyone can find with a few keystrokes. I am free to move about, but that freedom is hollow. It doesn't feel like relief. It feels like a large, empty room where every footstep echoes too loudly. I go on living, but I don't return to my old life. The people who left don't come back. Broken relationships don't mend themselves just because time passes. Evan is different. His path continues upward, exactly as I imagined on the day I signed those papers. I see him on the news in crowded photographs, confident smile, firm handshake. He has achieved the things I once hoped he would have: position, influence, a future. He doesn't call often. When he does, the conversations are short, polite, without depth. I don't know whether he will ever understand the whole story. Maybe he still believes I brought everything on myself. Maybe part of him suspects something, but chooses not to ask. I've learned that not all distance is created by conflict. Some distance is built from convenience. I live alone in a smaller house on the edge of the city. I grow plants, fix small things, read more books. The days pass evenly, without incident. Sometimes when I look back, I wonder what would have happened if I had chosen differently. If I had stood up, said everything, endured short-term chaos in exchange for long-term truth. Maybe I would be able to look straight into the mirror without avoiding my own eyes. Maybe I wouldn't. I'll never know. And perhaps that too is part of the price. Living with questions that have no answers. People often say that silence is complicity. I've heard that many times. I don't argue with it. I only know that my silence did not come from cowardice. It came from a very specific, very personal choice that no one but me could make. I accepted the loss of my reputation to keep my son's path from being cut short. I accepted the loss of a family in the traditional sense to preserve an image he may never have needed to know. There is no victory in this story. No one stands on a podium. There is only what remains after the decision is made, and what is gone forever. There are days when I am proud of my resolve. There are days when I feel I set myself aside too easily. Both feelings exist together without canceling each other out. I've learned to live with them the way you live with a scar that no longer hurts but always reminds you it once did. I don't expect to be fully understood. I only hope that if one day Evan looks back, he will see that his path did not come for free, and that there are sacrifices that are never recorded on paper. I didn't stay silent because I was weak. I stayed silent because love sometimes sounds like nothing at all. If you were in my place, would you choose to speak up to save yourself or stay silent to protect the one you love most? And where are you listening to this story from? At what moment in your life?